Hello, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. I hope it was good. I am Jacquelyn Melinek, like they mentioned, and today I'm joined by two chief business officers. So you guys are in for a treat. We're going to talk business today. We've got Raja Chakravorti from the Stellar Development Foundation and Tesfaye from Aptos Labs. You two obviously spend a lot of time in discussions with potential partners, major institutional players, and more. How would you kind of define the current state of institutional engagement with RWAs and stablecoins right now?
Yeah, and maybe to start, I think the reality is it's moved from beyond this, let me figure out if I want to do it, to I'm going to do it. Now, how do I actually engage? And I think that's really been the biggest transition we've seen, which is real engagement, pretty much at scale. I think what we're starting to see with a lot of the institutions we engage with is this much deeper question around, okay, how should we resource our teams? What should we build first? What is the opportunity that needs to be able to meet? And then what can be the next iteration? And so we're seeing this really deep engagement, and it's been incredibly exciting.
Echo all those points. We really have seen people really look at it from three different buckets. One, it's either I want to enhance distribution of a legacy product. We want to actually introduce a new product that blockchain enables, or they're taking a more back office approach where they believe it's going to have some cost savings and they're looking to implement it, or it's a parallel of a number of these different workflows.
What percentage of institutions, and I wouldn't imagine it's a massive one, but what percent are actually engaging today versus like on the sidelines?
Yeah, I think I would almost say like half of them are actually engaging. Now, engagement is like different metrics. It is, they've actually got the team and they're building, but like talking about actually rolling out a pilot, having the discussions at the C-suite, like I think there's like true engagement. And then you've got like this like maybe 30% that's just like really just tiptoeing around, and then maybe like 20% to a quarter who really have absolutely no idea. But we're seeing a lot.
From an institutional perspective, we think everybody basically at least has a strategy and thinking about it. I know EY put out some research that they said about 13% of the 500 and change that they actually interviewed actually are implementing stablecoins, for example. And then 80% said that they at least have a strategy around blockchain. But it's really hard to put your finger on it. And it's obviously jurisdiction by jurisdiction based as well.
Yeah, it's probably somewhere between all of the numbers that we said.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Between 0 and 100.
Yeah.
So how do we get that range of numbers to kind of like actually understand the perceived, or I guess go from like the perceived value to the real value of this, and like knock down that barrier, so to speak? Like, how do you kind of get the naysayers or skeptics?
I think Solomon was starting to touch on this, which is, if you think about like all of the things that are enabled with blockchain, blockchain isn't one thing. It is multiple components that are really oriented around, I think, the efficiency lever. So I think that is a really kind of easy discussion to start having, which is, hey, let's make things faster. Let's make them easier. Let's make them more cost efficient. And then you talk about distribution. Hey, like you have a product. Let's go out to a broader TAM because you're having more capability here. Or internally, like, if you're a CFO and you're thinking about how do I actually manage a function and turn it from a cost function to something that is revenue generating, how do I look at that? And so I think that is, it's turned into a much easier discussion, especially because we've now seen some really strong institutional grade opportunities out on the market. And so there's now also this opportunity to reflect and say, okay, look, what have other institutions done that we're seeing success at? And now let's potentially replicate that or expand on it.
Yes, I think historically, regulatory line of sight was the biggest barrier. And now, of course, with the Clarity Act and Genius Act, and not just from a US perspective, and look at other geographies, whether it's in APAC or UAE or whatever the case may be, you're getting a lot more clarity when it comes to regulation. But now it's more so, I think, interoperability. All right, how does this fit within my current tech stack? How do I plug in, let's say, an RWA product into my existing distribution pools? So I think operationalizing it now is something that everybody's trying to figure out.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think like ensuring that when we do this, there's liquidity is really, really important. Interoperability, I think, is one of the most important things for institutions as they think about, hey, look, like we're going to go issue the first thing, but how do we make sure it's broadly usable in all of the avenues we use it so it's actually accretive? We talk a little bit about this idea that when we talk about tokenizing things, like you don't just tokenize an asset because you can. It actually has to have inherent value to being tokenized, and that incremental distribution because it is like an attractive asset. It has a new yield profile that you want to be able to get out to other folks, or it represents some additional function that is going to generate value for the banks. Like that is actually the key. And so I think that is where the conversation really lies.
So you're not team tokenize everything?
I don't know that tokenizing everything makes a lot of sense. I mean, sure, you can go, tokenize a Lambo, but to what, to what end?
Yeah, and I really want to emphasize the point you just made is when you tokenize something, it doesn't immediately increase distribution from a primary perspective. You still need buyers. It doesn't increase secondary liquidity. You need buyers and sellers. So inherently just is actually just a back office solution. It's a ledger that allows for reduced friction, right, when you're actually moving anything of value. But it is very important to actually just look at it from a more practical perspective of what needs to be tokenized. Because even in the traditional markets, if you look at very esoteric asset classes, they don't even trade to any meaningful degree, let alone if you add tokenization. So there's just some practicalities around having a strategy around any particular asset class.
And that actually just triggered one additional conversation that I've been having with financial institutions is like, they also have to reconcile all of this on the back end. And right now, I think we are in a place with all the folks around here where we've been in it for a while, but like we're still at the very, very early stages. And so getting 24/7 liquidity for every asset may actually not be what a financial institution wants to do. They may not be ready. They might say, okay, what we actually want to do is do like a mirror ledgering system, but we also are going to still have our internal team reconciling all these things, and being able to like actually scale up to meet that is still something I think we're working through, which is why we see this kind of metered approach by financial institutions talking about, well, let's think about, and I will call this like a vanilla tokenized asset at this point, like like a tokenized treasury. Like we are seeing that plenty. T-bills, that's fine. But as we start thinking about private credit and we start thinking about access to different sort of things there, I think it is, let's make sure we've proven this, let's make sure we can handle it and we see the value and then step into the next thing.
Yeah.
I mean, tokenization is not necessarily a new topic or narrative out there, but I think it's gotten a lot of steam in the recent months to year about. And I think a lot of that probably is due to like the regulatory changes. Now institutions feel like they could touch this. Based off of that and the conversations that you guys are having, what is actually being sticky when you talk to these institutions? Like, to your point, Raja, you're like, don't tokenize everything. And I agree with you on that. I've been saying that. I think it's kind of a waste and it dilutes the value of things that actually should be tokenized. But when institutions come to you, like, what is their interest? Where do they lie on that?
Yeah, and I'd say, like as Solomon was kind of describing, I think initially, like the idea of like regulation being a barrier, I think that's somewhat been, at least like in the institutional mindset, been solved with,
right.
The
Genius Act. They know it's coming, if not already.
Yeah, and now it's really about operationalizing the asset. And so the things I think about with that are they're thinking about, is this an interoperable thing? Like if we release it, is there going to be true liquidity? We spend a lot of time thinking about velocity of that asset. So, is it important for that asset to just be tokenized and then somebody just as a buyer holds it? Or is it going to actually have velocity in that asset? Does it increase and take advantage of the distribution capabilities? I'll use this opportunity to actually potentially plug, one of the things that we've done with Stellar and why I'm so excited to be here is we just joined Chainlink's Scale program. And part of that is incorporating CCIP as well as their oracles to really help lean into that idea of interoperability. But for us, I think that's really important to kind of unstick where the financial institutions are.
Yeah.
And from an institutional perspective, what we seem to see that resonates with them is they see all the capital formation that's happening on chain. When you think of just Aptos, we traded about 60 billion of stablecoins last month alone. So they're seeing all this activity on chain, and they want to have their legacy products have interoperability. They want that capital to be able to be deployed into their very traditional assets, whether it's money market funds, whether it's private credit, whether it's commodities, whether it's synthetic exposure to public equity, whatever the case may be. And so they need to tokenize those assets so then they can have that connectivity. And then also they're looking at creative ways to enhance yield of those very traditional products. And so whether it's having some level of interoperability on the DeFi side, whether it's adding some utility so it's not just a position you hold, can you use it as collateral in a centralized exchange? The creative aspects to basically create some level of connectivity between these two worlds is where we see the most enthusiasm from the institutional perspective.
Yeah, and then I also want to kind of get both of your takes on like the utility and use cases beyond just like vanity metrics like TVL or something. Obviously people love to like kind of boast those things with RWAs and stablecoins, but what do you kind of see as like the true unlock on that front then?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this a lot at the foundation, where TVL is that vanity metrics, but like to be honest, like you can game that pretty easily. Like you tokenize something and somebody just holds it, and that to us isn't really doing the thing that you want with the asset. So for us, we've really leaned into this idea of velocity as being the most important metric. Once something is tokenized, how is it moving? How is it changing hands? And most importantly, and I think you just touched on this, yield. I think like yield and creating opportunities to get access to that at scale, I think is really the driver here. Being able to put RWAs into DeFi so that you're able to generate more value than would otherwise be able. Creating liquidity for something that would be really attractive, but you may have to be in the current state like a qualified institutional investor, like for like a CLO, like a AAA rated CLO. Once you tokenize it, put it on the chain, now you've opened up the aperture in a tremendous way, and I think that's really exciting.
Yes, echo all those points. Really, that's why I was emphasizing volume as opposed to TVL. We want to see the capital being put to work as opposed to being stagnant. And so we're really focused on any type of either volume metric or utility metric. Once you have an asset tokenized, how can it interact with the broder universe?
It's almost like we're the same blockchain.
That sounds right. We have to do a lot more collaboration.
Business officers,
I think a partnership's coming out of this.
Yeah, you guys are going to work together?
That's right.
I made the panel earlier also agree to a deal, so you guys got to agree to a deal.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll take a small commission.
Yeah, just a small one. Yeah, of course. With RWAs and stablecoins, I see them kind of transcending beyond where we are today. I feel like they're in early stages. We're kind of testing out and seeing like where things are actually going. Raja, you brought up like yield-bearing assets as something of interest to you guys. What is kind of like the next level for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like to think about this idea of like lazy money versus active money. And so I think the first iteration of stablecoins that we saw, I think really solved very specific problems. I think the user experience problem, very important, making sure that cash was able to, it's basically like digitizing cash. I think now really that next aspect of how do you drive yield to users who otherwise wouldn't have access to it, that's everything. And again, we talk about like the first things that we saw that have had scale. You saw Franklin Templeton issue Benji, you've got BlackRock Spittle, like you've got institutional grade players showing the ability for these assets to drive a lot of value. Now it's really kind of expanding into some of these other areas. And so we talked about some of these other opportunities. I think the other area that I'm really excited about is starting to think about like international kind of assets, like Mexican sovereign debt, for example. We're working with a company called Etherfuse within our ecosystem that is focused on tokenizing that, putting that on the blockchain, which creates a lot of value, particularly for other local markets outside the US. And I think once we build that and build kind of a global system for that, that's going to be incredibly valuable.
From my perspective, it's really diversification of use cases. Right now, when you think of like stablecoin volume, it's primarily driven by trading. We're really excited about remittance, microfinancing, cross-border transactions, whether it's B2B transactions and so forth, and really parsing that data out. And from there, once you start to add broader access to this stablecoin usage, the wallet really becomes like a brokerage account. And then you start to see, okay, now they're looking to have yield, all right? Maybe they need to deploy some of that stablecoin into money market funds, into private credit. And so really goes back to that democratization of access and basically portfolio management and so forth. But really, that's kind of the areas we're focused on more so than just pure trading.
I think this is like one other component which is really important, which is just ensuring that the ramps work really well. So again, like the idea is how do you make these assets incredibly usable and valuable and part of your everyday life? Being able to ensure that you're able to off-ramp them in a local economy is really important. On-ramping makes it super easy. And so you're almost kind of obfuscating the idea that is now on the blockchain and more just like an infrastructure play that allows somebody to use it however they want to use it.
What would you guys kind of define as the tipping point for institutional involvement? Because obviously we're in the early days. You guys talked about the percentages. So maybe they're coming in, but how would you kind of define that, and by like what time frame would you feel confident that they're fully here?
I think
go ahead.
I think in my mind, like the tipping point is when it is the treasurer of a financial institution saying, here's how many bips I saved and here's how many days I saved, rather than the innovation team. Like that, I think, is the nirvana for financial institutions. And I think, in terms of a time horizon, I think there's still that adoption curve, but that to me is what's going to signal like this is full scale.
I think the indication when it's truly like we have that level of adoption is probably when we stop even talking about blockchain, right? When I go on Amazon, I don't care if the website's coded in PHP or Ruby on Rails. I just want my package in under 2 days. If I go trade, I don't talk about electronic trading. I just simply trade. So it just becomes synonymous with any type of commerce. So I think that will be an indication that there's broader adoption. I think it will come down to interoperability. Once we have clear regulatory line of sight, not just in the U.S. but in any of the geographies where obviously we're trying to drive adoption, I think that's a given. But then interoperability will be the second phase of that.
Yeah, amazing. Well, Raja, Solomon, thank you so much for taking the time, and thank you to everyone for listening in.